All right, friends, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. I'm not sure if there's there we go. We'll go ahead and get started. Please find your seats, grab some coffee. If there's any food left, I don't know. Just a couple of announcements before I introduce the session and our guests. I'm delighted that you're all here. Please do, if you haven't already, at the end of the session, be sure to sign in at our computer, particularly if you're a student. It helps us keep track of our numbers, and it's the only way you will get crafted teaching credit if you're interested in that sort of thing. So please do sign in. We ran out of plastic forks, so we have metal forks. Please don't throw them out. You can put them in our famous yellow soapy vat, which is at the side there when you're done with it. Finally, just to announce our two remaining crafted teaching programs for autumn 2017. We have our quarterly Dean's Seminar coming up. Michael Kessler from Georgetown University will be with us for a seminar on religion, morality, and conflicting claims for justice. It's going to be a fascinating seminar. That will be in here on November 10th, and you can RSVP to the craft teaching email address. Finally, we have our micro-teaching workshop, which involves intensive teaching practice. That is open only to Divinity PhD students, I'm afraid, but there are 2 spots left, very strictly limited. So if you're interested, please do email us for more information. So it's my very great pleasure to invite you, to welcome you to Pedagogy Unbound. This is an event that's been a long time in the making. The craft teaching has been growing and deepening these past 5 years, and one of the developments I'm most enthusiastic about is the recognition that university education is one core part of a larger commitment to raising the level of understanding around religion in our society in a variety of ways. Divinity School trained educators are doing this in a range of ways. They're doing this as university faculty, and they're doing this in professions from journalism to museum work to NGOs, nonprofits, and those are only the professions that we have represented here today, and there are certainly many more out there in which the Divinity School is changing the texture of understanding around religion in the United States and well beyond. From the perspective of the crafted teaching program, then every student at the Divinity School, everyone who is trained in one of our many programs, has the potential and we hope the obligation to be an outstanding educator. So our panel today consists of 3 Divinity School alumni from 3 different programs who are working at the frontiers of education about religion beyond academia. Pull up my handy cheat sheet here. Very gradually. So we have first Heather Miller-Rubens, who's the Executive Director and Roman Catholic Scholar for the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. In her research, Miller-Rubens explores how religious communities navigate political, legal, and cultural spaces, as well as how different religious communities relate to one another in particular contexts. In addition to historical research, Rubens develops educational initiatives that foster interreligious learning for the public in the Baltimore-Washington corridor. She's been an adjunct professor at Lewis University, DePaul University, and St. Mary's Seminary, and is a member of the Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Second, we have Jeremy Fusey, a religion journalist and former editor of Real Clear Religion, an online hub which aggregates writing on religious and interreligious topics from a variety of reputable sources, bringing together contributions from a range of ideological and cultural perspectives. Fusey is now working as an independent journalist with a focus on religion. And finally, Alice Greenwald is the president and CEO of the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. She has a long and eminent career in the museum profession, having previously served in a variety of directorial and curatorial roles at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the National Museum of American Jewish History, the Hebrew Union College Skirball Museum, and more. Those are only the ones I could fit on the website. She is the author of several articles in museum studies, art history, and historiography, and she's received awards including an NEA Fellowship for Museum Professionals. So the structure of our panel today is we'll hear from each panelist in turn in a fairly informal way about their work, about how they got from the Divinity School to where they are now, and about their sense of the roles that education around religion can play in our society in the present and going forward into the years to come. After we hear from all three of them, we'll have the opportunity to open it up for general conversation, and of course you're encouraged to pose questions to one another, and it'll be great. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our panel today.
I first want to start by thanking you, Aaron, for organizing this and for seeing it through from our conversations last winter till now. I'm just delighted to be here, delighted to be back in the common room at Swift Hall. I also want to recognize Cameron Ferguson. Thank you also for your warm hospitality yesterday. And Dean Zoloff, it's wonderful to see you again, and wonderful to meet you, Dean Ferguson. So I'm going to organize my remarks into two main sections. First, I'm just going to give you an overview of the ICJS, its history, its mission, its audiences, and constituencies. Rather than Pedagogy Unbound, there are boundaries to public education, and so we're going to talk about those and the constraints that we experience in that realm. And then, because it's a pedagogy workshop, I'm going to bring in some of the handouts that we've used at large-scale public events. And talk about the reasons why we structured them the way we did, sort of the commitments that lie behind them, both pedagogical and institutional. I brought more than I have time to talk about, and so I will make those available afterwards, but to give you sort of a broad sense of what we're doing at the ICJS in Baltimore. So a brief history of the organization here. Let's see if this... Uh-oh. The pinwheel. That is never a good sign. The brief history of the organization. We were founded in 1987 as the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies. You'll notice that there's been, a name change, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the conversation. Anyway, a group of business leaders and civic leaders in Baltimore who got together after the 9th National Workshop for Christian-Jewish Relations in 1986. And they decided that they really wanted to bring the lessons of the Academy and the develops in Jewish-Christian relations from Vatican II forward to the local community, and wanted to educate specifically clergy around these issues and these trends. And so very much kind of keeping with the interfaith relations at the time, you've brought your rabbis, your ministers, and your priests into a room, right? That's the beginning of all good jokes, and especially all good interfaith jokes. And so those folks were brought together. Our founding executive director, Chris Layton, sort of led the charge, and the decision was made that they were going to go out of business in 3 to 5 years. That sort of all the problems between Judaism and Christianity would be solved within that amount of time, and they could go out of business. It was a very much driven, again, by local business leaders in a sort of amusing way. Thankfully, we're still here 30 years later, because it was seen that the problems are immense and that the challenges are there, and so we need to sort of engage them consistently and constructively on a regular basis. We've grown as an organization. We now have a staff of 9. Again, that's sort of not enough, but we're doing what we can. So the first phase, as I said, I want to talk about our learning communities first and then slide into our mission statement. So our learning communities, at the very beginning, we worked with congregations through clergy, and it was a clergy-only enterprise for roughly the first 10 years. Then there was a shift to thinking about, well, hey, clergy have people that they're talking to. We should also engage in congregational education. And so then that's roughly the next 10 years in the life of the organization is an expansion to doing clergy education and congregational education. We're now in a new and exciting phase to think more robustly about religious literacy in the public square, and are not requiring congregational membership or affiliation to participate in our programs. I'm delighted to announce that we just received a generous startup grant to work with Baltimore City high school teachers and I'll talk a little bit more about learning cohorts, but they're sort of on the front lines of religious and interreligious literacy. And so we'll be able to work with 6 teachers from the city public schools, 6 from independent or private schools, and 6 from religious schools in Baltimore. And we've got funding for 3 years, so we'll have 3 cohorts of 18 teachers. And this is also a recognition on our part, because my fellow colleagues were all PhDs, that we are not high school educators, and that is in fact a distinct gift and a distinct skill. And so we weren't going to be able to develop curriculum that they could deploy. The other recognition on our part was that these teachers have different institutional constraints. Teaching about Muhammad in a 12th grade Catholic high school in a religion class is going to be very different than teaching about Muhammad in a city high school history class. And so again, we're not going to be able to develop a one-size-fits-all, but if we work closely with the teachers over the course of the year and have them identify where they think religious literacy can fit and provide them with good resources, that will be a better result for all of us. And our hope is to have these lessons at the end of these years made available for other teachers, again, but identified through specific context. So this lesson was developed for an urban city public high school 10th grade history course, a survey of, whatever. So that way people know where this lesson was supposed to live. The other group that we'll talk about today is after the death of Freddie Gray and the uprising in Baltimore in 2015. There was a sort of recognition on the part of the Institute, well, what does interfaith learning and studies, what do we have to say to this crisis in our city, in our home? And sort of thinking, well, how do we incorporate that into, is that me? That is me. Incorporate that into the life of the Institute. And so we brought in a group of local activists who would self-identify as Jewish, Christian, or Muslim to an intensive year-long program with us, again, as a sort of cohort of learners to have conversations. But we also developed public programming around this cohort, and I will talk more about that later in the presentation. So that's the type of work that we're doing right now, again, firmly rooted with congregations, but also reaching out beyond the walls of congregations and to see how religious literacy and interreligious literacy can operate in the public square. So our mission statement, I want to just again to give the context of where we work. I don't know if you can see it back there. It's to building learning communities where religious difference becomes a powerful force for good. So the 3 segments of that, building learning communities. We are trying to distinguish ourselves from interfaith activists or interfaith cooperation events, right? So the interfaith world has the interfaith doers and the interfaith dialoguers as a sort of the rough breakdown between them. And all of this is of value. I'm not negating anything, but I'm just trying to demarcate what we see ourselves as an organization doing. So there are a lot of people who will bring people together for a food drive or for some sort of social justice event. That is in and of itself a good. But there isn't necessarily a literacy component that comes with it. You get to know who somebody is, but you don't necessarily talk about what you believe or where your commitments are. On the flip side, you've got the accusation, well, you're having all this dialogue, how does it manifest into the world? And so then there's a sense that the talking leads to nothing. And so what we're trying to do is to really define ourselves as people who are devoted to learning, and that the act of co-learning itself is a good, and specifically a kind of civic good. So we're not interested in sort of disembodied religious others or hermeneutical religious others. We're interested in embodied religious others, right? So an example of this, what do I mean by building a learning community? We have a partnership with the Washington Theological Consortium. That's the 12 Christian seminaries in the Mid-Atlantic. It's from Richmond all the way up to Gettysburg, so it's a pretty broad swath of geography. But all of the sort of Christian seminaries in that region participate in the WTC. They wanted to have a literacy component in Judaism, but there's only one school nearby, RRC, Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. And so we fly in rabbinical students from JTS, from Ziegler out in California, from HUC, from up in Boston, and we have an intensive week-long seminar with Christian seminarians who've been nominated by their deans of their respective schools, and the rabbinical students who are coming in from those schools. We have to consciously build a learning community of interreligious co-learners. So that involves recruitment, it involves funding, it involves all of that. But it is filling a gap in seminary formation and in seminary education that the deans recognize and value, and also the ATS is requiring, which is always good for business, that there is an interreligious component in formation in America's theological schools. So building learning communities. You've got that now? You've got a sense of what that involves? All right, religious difference. Again, sort of thinking about the landscape of interfaith. There is a move to commonality, an important move. That's not where we like to sit. We like to kind of slide past commonality and go right for differences. And to try to say that our differences aren't something to be afraid of. They're not something that's necessarily combustible that we have to hide away, but in fact something that we need to engage. And then generally people, for the most part, walk out of our programs, oh, okay, well that wasn't so bad, right? We haven't had any fistfights in the parking lot, that at least that I'm aware of. So again, that's what we're trying to do, is focus on religious difference. And then finally, becoming a powerful force for good. This is the idea that interreligious learning and these learning communities are themselves a civic good. So one of our goals, and if you can see this at the bottom, is resilient interreligious networks across Baltimore specifically. And we think that we achieve these goals both looking back and going forward through two things. Through actual relationship building, so having cohorts of people, right? You gain a certain camaraderie when you go through a class together, as you undoubtedly know. And so what does that mean if you're sort of with the same people for an extended period of time having an experience? You have a real relationship. But we want that real relationship to be grounded in knowledge and co-learning. And we want that to be the activity that is the grounding for the interreligious encounter. Okay, so that's my sort of 30,000 feet, this is who we are and this is what we're doing. I'm going to slide into different resources that we have and that we hand out at different events to talk about, and then talk about the sort of pedagogical decisions that are made behind that. Ah, there it is again.
So last thing it worked just
what did you
down
do?
here at the bottom. Just slid away.
Jumping ahead. All right. So one of the things that we like to hand out at the beginning of almost every program, so this is from our work with the WTC seminarians and rabbinical students to our large public events, is our debate versus dialogue sheet. Again, so one of our markers of success, what we always say publicly to groups at the beginning of a program, we know we have achieved something if you are able to articulate the position of someone with whom you deeply disagree in a way that he or she will say, yes, that's what I mean. That is our goal. We are not trying to change or convert anyone at that point in time. Again, that's also a fear when people walk into interfaith spaces. We are trying to get people to really, truly understand each other in a deeper way. And so we're trying to cultivate the act of listening. And so the sort of dialogue versus debate is there as kind of a guidelines. Again, people slide very easily into debate. And as trained at this august institution, I myself will slide very easily into debate. And so it's a good sort of corrective to have, that what you're trying to do is understand someone deeply on the other end and not try to argue with their position, that that's not your first move. All right, so that's a broad thing that sort of goes across all programs. I will bring up two final pedagogical points that we can discuss later on. One has to do with talking about confronting anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. What's the most effective way to do that? Our argument is that you do not do that with Judaism 101 or Islam 101. Right? That's when somebody is walking up with you with a certain amount of fear, prejudice, bias, or whatever, you have to sort of engage the lenses through which Judaism and Islam are understood before you can have the Islam 101 or Judaism 101 question or conversation at that point in time. And so We had a Confronting Islamophobia speaker series in the spring of this year. We had 3 public lecturers, Anwar Iman from the University of Toronto, Engi Abdelkader from Georgetown, and Corey Saylor from CARE, the Council for American Islamic Relations, and then Todd Green from Luther College, but he was at the State Department at the time, so we had an invitation-only event, not a public event. So for Anwar Iman, who if you are not familiar with his work, please go out and be familiar with his work. He's fabulous. He gave the discussion a public lecture on Sharia and Sharia bans. And so we provided everyone in the audience, we had about 200 people at the Reginald Lewis Museum in Baltimore, with a takeaway sheet. We also have a PDF version of this. On the one side is the Islam 101, what is Sharia, right? Because people want that information. But on the other side is the sort of what is the Sharia ban, the Islamophobia 101. How should you understand this in context? And I think when you're doing large-scale public events and educations, you have to really think about the lenses through which the audience is approaching the event, and try to educate, to get them to be aware of the lens, and then to also provide literacy around the lens. And so we did this for each of the lectures. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through them. The last little tidbit before I hand over the mic, I want to talk about the Imagining Justice in Baltimore initiative. This is the initiative that has everything our institute does in one neat package. So this is the one that we developed in the post-Freddie Gray uprising. We recruited activists, 23 of them that worked with us for a year in an interreligious learning cohort. They're the sort of anchor for the entire program. And then we had 3 public lectures surrounding this to raise literacy in the public square. We had Robert Franklin, who's at Emory, former president of Morehouse, Mark Gopin, who's at George Mason, and Najiba Syed, who's at Claremont. And so we had them talk about justice as refracted through their understanding of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, respectively, to sort of have different voices on this topic in the public square at Baltimore at this time. Prior to the public lectures, we had workshops, so the activists could meet the scholar and sort of bridge that divide that is often there. And these were closed workshops. It was just the 23 activists with the scholar for about 3 hours prior to the public lecture, which is a wonderful opportunity. And then in the fall, we had citywide conversations. So we recruited 200 people from across the city to participate in dialogue with each other, and we had people at round tables. This was very labor intensive on the front end. We asked people to self-identify if they felt comfortable with a religious tradition or community, and then we consciously created learning tables of 8 to 10 people. We asked them to commit to 4 sessions, 1 a month, 2 hours apiece, 7 to 9 p.m. So we have 8 hours, right? So I want you to, talking about the boundaries of public pedagogy, you have a very limited amount of time. 8 hours with folks, right? And that's including coffee breaks and pleasantries and where is the bathroom and all of that. So what can we do? How can we maximize this 8-hour experience? We chose to do interfaith learning through a biographical entry point, right? So how many of you are familiar with scriptural reasoning as something that's in the toolbox, right? Scriptural reasoning in its classic form, as you have the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran. You have textual things sort of put side by side. That works for some groups. It's a good tool to have. We use it when it's appropriate. For large-scale public conversations, it really doesn't work well because people aren't coming in with the necessary training to have those conversations in a way that ends up not being more harmful or offensive to other people. And so that's the sort of danger of that. There's also, the danger of offense is one. The danger of reticence is the other. And that someone may not feel, well, I'm not going to say that about your sacred text because I don't want to offend you, right? So you have a potential error on both sides. And so if you go through a biographical entry point, this is the... Thank you. It might just be your presence. Anyway, the biographical entry point allows for multiple points of access. What are you?
How many more?
Keep going until you see Heschel.
Don't stop until you get Heschel.
Don't stop until you see Heschel.
It's a good lesson for life. Something wacky is going on here.
So we wanted to talk about inequity and justice in Baltimore, and so we wanted to talk about racial inequity, economic inequity, and gender inequity. All of these are large topics. We also wanted to provide literacy in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Again, large topics. And we wanted to have people have time for conversation. So we decided in our 4 sessions, one was just an introductory session to have people get to know one another. The other 3 sessions, we did one tradition per night, recognizing that we essentially had 40 minutes to lecture, and then the rest of the time was for public conversation. And so we chose Heschel to talk about racial inequity, Dorothy Day to talk about economic inequity, and Amina Wadud to talk about gender justice. And so through the biographies of those folks, we then presented, so I did Dorothy Day, so that's the example that I'm going to linger on. We provided the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25. We also, in addition to that, provided one of her commentaries from the Catholic Worker, where she talks about the deserving and undeserving poor, which riffs off of Matthew, also riffs off of Christian tradition and hospitality and Christian tradition as she defines it, to come up with a sort of an argument against having the category of deserving or undeserving poor. And so that provided participants in the program multiple access points. If they wanted to talk about Matthew, they could talk about Matthew. If they wanted to talk about Dorothy Day's life, they could talk about Dorothy Day's life. If they wanted to talk about her writings and her interpretation of Matthew, that was also a possibility. So I can zoom in potentially.
The way the future goes.
Yes. So this is how you can get all your PDFs in one place. It's not PowerPoint, but apparently it doesn't work so well. Anyway, so the category of undeserving and deserving poor, you've got her writings, her life story, the Gospel of Matthew, the corporal works of mercy, also as she understood them through the Catholic tradition. So there's multiple points of access for people to engage. There's also a very serious literacy component. And our final point is you see someone engaging his or her religious tradition and voicing that in the public square. And this is another institutional commitment we have, which is to sort of flood the public square with a diversity of religious perspectives, and to empower people to use religious idioms and argumentation in that space. And so attached to this initiative, we have a Huffington Post blog where we work with local people who are trying to write in this voice and to give them a platform to participate in a larger public conversation. I'm going to stop there, and I welcome questions at the end of the panel, but I look forward to talking with you soon. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Jeremy, just give me 1 second. Actually, yeah, go ahead. This is very strange. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, as Aaron pointed out at dinner last night, I am subverting expectations, I guess, since I'm the youngest panelist, but also the only one not using PowerPoint technology. But my notes are on my iPhone, so I guess I'm not that radical. But truly, I'm humbled to be on a panel with Alice and Heather, who have accomplished a great deal and are true inspiration. And I hope to showcase the fascinating world of religion journalism more than what I've done in the mere 2 years since I've graduated. So I'm briefly going to touch on what my job was as the religion editor at Real Clear Politics. And that is a job that I had for the last year and a half up until last month. I will talk about how that differs from what I'm doing now, and what I think you all should know about the religion beat and how it intersects or sometimes fails to intersect with the academic world. So after I graduated from here, I was lucky enough to find myself in charge of Real Clear's religion vertical called Real Clear Religion. And it thrust me into the world of online journalism as I worked partially remotely and also went into the newsroom in DC. My responsibility was to draw readers in by composing a popular daily link roundup of the best writing about religion on the web. And then once they were there, I got to recruit contributors to write original pieces. These contributors were religious leaders, academics, lay people, students. And so that was a lot of fun. And I got the site up to about 3 to 5 original pieces a week that I would edit and then post. I also had the chance to write whenever I could, but I was mostly pretty busy and often frustratingly so. I was kind of stuck behind the scenes being a one-man religion section. But be careful what you ask for, because last month the funding suddenly dried up for that job, and I currently find myself in the role of a freelancer now. So I am writing for other editors, which it has been fun to write again. I would not recommend freelancing as your only source of income. There's a thin line between freelancing and unemployment that I'm kind of walking right now. But whatever job comes next for me will likely be a general assignment position. Unfortunately, religion journalism jobs are rare, but this reality is not driven by economics. Religion pieces get clicks. People are hungry to read stories that take religion seriously. And I don't have to tell you all that it takes great care to talk about religion, playing with fire, if you will. And so one of the problems is that many people don't exactly understand what religion journalism is. I think if I were to say to you, I was a science reporter or I was a business reporter, you would immediately understand that. But it often happens that when I tell someone that I'm a religion journalist, they generally ask, about my personal religious background and picture me writing devotionals or something like that, which is not exactly what I do. And they think more religious journalism than religion journalism. So I think that's important, but I think it's also important to make the good business argument that those of us in the humanities might tend to shy away from. Because anytime, say, Emma Green writes a piece in The Atlantic, it shows up in the most read section. There are a lot of great local religion journalists that are within the USA Today network, and when their pieces get picked up for syndication, they get a tremendous amount of views. And so news organizations need to understand that we can make them money and are not just a public service. We don't want politics reporters, God bless them, being the only ones writing about religion. This not only limits the religious groups that get coverage, but also ignores the other crucial subjects that religion intersects with. One of the things that was most helpful to me has been a professional organization called the Religion News Association. This group includes pretty much every reporter and editor who covers religion in the United States. I would guess probably about 200 people. And it was actually pretty funny. I was at the annual conference last month, and I did not know very many people there. But slowly, as the panels progressed and as the days progressed, all of the people who are now religion reporters who went to Divinity School just sort of started finding each other until we were all hanging out in one group. And Taryn was there, and so it was great to see University of Chicago represented, so that made me happy. But Harvard Divinity School is very well represented in that group of people, so we have some work to do to give them a run for their money. But this group of people form a truly great community, and we all regularly interact on Twitter, bouncing ideas off each other, asking for sourcing advice, and promoting each other's work. I couldn't be an effective journalist without Twitter, which can be another disconnect from the sometimes insular academic world. And Twitter is a great tool, and it is also awful and will suck up all of your time. But I do think it is necessary as part of engaging with both colleagues in the journalism field and with the general public and getting your pieces out there. And speaking of that, I think I have noticed a change in the disposition of many of the Div School students since I was here. My biggest complaint about this great community is that students seemed to only pay attention mostly, and understandably so, to their field of study and what they were particularly interested in, and sort of would bury their head in the sand and not particularly pay attention to what was going on with current events. But I think the election of Trump does seem to have changed this quite a bit, and I do hope that will result in a more outward-looking engagement and interest in educating the public about religion in general. But I think the biggest disconnect that I've noticed between the educational world and the journalism world is the speed at which the news cycle happens. Following the news cycle can be exhausting, much like using Twitter, but it is essential for editing and reporting. When something comes up like the former director of the FBI having a Twitter handle that is Reinhold Niebuhr, that creates a certain news tag, a news hook that you can use to talk about a subject that would otherwise be considered boring. But that means that you have maybe 48 hours to get a quote from a Niebuhr expert for your piece, a pace that can seem pretty pushy for a lot of academics. Some of the best writing happens, I think, when the news hook allows for exploration of topics like that. So like the Pope called space this week, that was pretty cool. And so that would offer an opportunity to talk about the history of the Catholic Church and science and so on. And I do think the Marty Center is one solution to act as sort of a middle person between the academic world and the news cycle that just keeps churning. It has the potential to be a great resource for religion journalists out there going forward. So I'm excited to see all the work that they're doing. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the reality that comment sections are often awful. And I think that's particularly true with religion journalism. And it became very clear to me after posting stories that rampant Islamophobia, as well as anti-Mormon and anti-Catholic sentiment, really lays bare the hurdles to using the internet to increase religious literacy. And I will close with, I guess, sort of a practical recommendation for getting the most out of religion journalism, which is knowing who the writer is in the byline. I think that is more important even than the publication that it comes from. And Div School students would do well to learn some of them. And I actually have a list. If anyone is interested, you can email me, and I can send you some great recommendations of people to follow. But journalism is in the middle of a crisis of funding right now that's still being sorted out. And this means that some organizations that can afford to hire full-time religion writers have denominational backing. And so there are great writers at, say, America, the Jesuit magazine, or Christianity Today, the evangelical publication, places that we might not generally tend to go. So I think it's important that we don't just rely on the Times and the Post, and we seek out good religion writing where it is. So I think I'm going to end it there for now, and hopefully something I said can provoke an interesting question or two. Thanks.
Thank you. So Alice, we can now hope that this works. Just give it a moment to come back on. No, that's not red. That's not red at all.
Is it still zoomed from before?
Yeah, but I don't know how to unzoom it. That's what I just did, but it went into...
That's a settings issue.
It's in the presentation.
Could you get going again? Yeah. Just because the whole thing is, the whole thing is messed up.
The mirror.
Do you know where that lives, that setting? And why the screen is so... Bear with us, folks. Thank you. I'm not sure why it got so... Well, Bill's Sure. Oh.
This is part of the justification there.
It is, yeah.
To seek out this next generation.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started. Bill will get
great. I mean, she's one of the reasons why.
Yeah, and these, good afternoon. These are just going to be background images and video to give you a sense if you haven't been to the 9/11 Memorial Museum, just what it is, but it's not tied to my remarks. So whenever he gets here, and he's here, we'll get it started.
Hey.
Are we done with the pressing?
Mm-hmm.
It's never done this before.
Should be on mirror instead of presenter.
It is mirroring at the moment.
But you want it to not
But
be.
the same for two displays.
When you put it into take over the screen mode, it should take care of the mirroring. But for some reason, it doesn't want to do that.
This is my subversive way of getting you to come to New York.
Yeah, that's
Started.
exactly what we're doing.
Never done.
No, technology has never been.
It's an older version. It's on an older machine. It's a big file.
Yes.
So it will take as long as it does.
Okay.
You're
Telling us something. And we'll start on the.
Still don't know about that.
Yeah, well, we'll get it going. Thank you. All right, so I'm just going to talk while you're looking, and we'll begin. So first of all, again, I want to offer my thanks to Aaron and Cameron and to the deans and my co-panelists. It's a real pleasure to meet you and to be here. And I have not stepped foot in this room for 42 years. I know many of you are younger than that, so it's been a while. But I think my particular journey may resonate with some of you, and I'm going to start with the personal and then move into the work that I do. And what you're looking at right now, just so you know, is drone footage of the interior spaces of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. And then there'll be some slides that'll just repeat with images from the exhibitions and some of our programs that seem relevant to the discussion today. But, I went to Divinity School because I wanted to teach at the college level. That's what I thought I wanted to do. I had what was then known as a Danforth Fellowship. And I arrived, it turned out, at a moment of change in the department that I had been accepted to, which was known as History of Religion, when I applied. And I was coming to study what in my day was called comparative religion. And I had come specifically because of Mercy Eliade, who's taught here. And when I got here, a single letter had been added to the department name. It was now called the History of Religions. And Eliade went emeritus that September. And I found myself working with a whole new cast of characters who I knew very little about when I got here. And that was Jonathan Z. Smith, who was my advisor, Joe Kitagawa, Chuck Long, Nathan Scott, great teachers. But it wasn't what I had come here looking for. And it didn't feel like a fit to me. I had come to study folklore and mythology in the Eliade mode, and had come from Sarah Lawrence, where Joe Campbell's spirit was ever present. And, Campbell's great line was "follow your bliss," and I seemed to be off track when I was here. Quite honestly, I met some of the smartest people I have ever met in my life here, studied with some of the best teachers I have ever been privileged to be a student of, but it wasn't my bliss. And I was asked very early on in my graduate school career to identify a particular religion in a particular place at a particular time to become expert in. And I was literally stumped, and I mumbled something about, well, I know a little bit about Judaism, and voila, suddenly I was the Jewish studies grad student focusing on Ashkenazi women in the 16th century. Okay, what? And literally a chance situation changed everything for me. I was working on a paper about women's devotional prayer, and I could not find the resources in Regenstein Library. And my professor sent me to a small college of Judaica in the Loop, Spertus College, that was known to have a fantastic library, which it did. What I didn't expect to encounter when I got there was a charming little Jewish museum on the ground floor. And of course, that was the Spertus Museum, and it intrigued me. This would not happen today, I have to say, but I literally went to the library, did my research, got my information, found the director's office, knocked on the door, poked my head in and said, "Do you need a researcher this summer?" And he said, "Yes." And I had a summer job, and that job opened a world of opportunity to me that I would never have imagined or envisioned. I went on to a career in Jewish museums. Initially, my work at Spertus led to an opportunity at a Jewish museum in LA, then known just as the HUC Skirball Museum. Now it's the Skirball Center or something or another. But I finished my master's degree here. I took a year leave of absence because I thought I would just take a short break from my academic work, and I ended up staying in that job for 6 years. And I learned on the job. I loved it. I loved the visual as well as the verbal aspects of museum work. I loved the tactility of exhibition installation. I particularly loved the way exhibitions required a very deep dive into complex information, that the goal of learning it was actually to translate that information for the widest accessibility for the public at large, which I found very satisfying. I went from Skirball on to direct a Jewish museum in Philadelphia, the Museum of American Jewish History. Had 2 children along the way. I stayed at the Philadelphia Museum for about 5 years, and then got a call from a colleague in the Jewish Museum Network, which at that time was rather small, to join what was called the design team for a permanent exhibition at what would become the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. That project was really the place where I learned my craft of what memorial museums are all about. And I stayed on that job, or with that organization, for 19 years. until one day in the fall of 2005, I got a call from the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation in New York asking me to relocate to New York City to create a museum at Ground Zero. And I literally said to the person on the other end of the phone, who in their right mind would take that job? And here I am. So I did. We created a museum. You're looking at some images of it right now. I'm now, some years later, 11 years later, the president and CEO of the memorial and the museum. So one of the questions that Aaron asked me to speak about is how education about religion figures into my work and my career. And there's some fairly obvious connections to religion. You work in a Jewish museum, obviously you're dealing with Jewish ceremonial objects, you're dealing with cultural and religious history that is part and parcel of the content. In fact, when I was at the Skirball Museum, I put in a grant proposal to the NEH to do an exhibition on what I called bindings, which I saw as a root metaphor of Jewish ritual life. And I would never have used the term root metaphor had I not been here, quite honestly. So clearly my way of thinking and my approach to the material that I was working with as a museum professional was very much informed by the analytical approaches that I was trained to use in dealing with content. When I went on to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, clearly that project is less about religion, actually, even though Jews were clearly targets of genocide. But the anti-Semitism, the genocidal push was more racially based than actually faith-based in the Nazi context. But still, the greater tools that I had in my toolbox, which came from the University of Chicago Divinity School, were completely applicable to the work that we were doing there. And that was true as well of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. Here again, the connection to religion is contextual. Al-Qaeda, the perpetrators of terror, are self-identified as Muslim. But theirs is a political Islamism, which one needed to be very careful about creating distinctions in the presentation of the history to separate political Islam from normative Islam. And I believe, again, my training provided that level of sensitivity that we could, at times, negotiate very difficult moments in order to tell the story, but to be clear that religion as a motivating factor doesn't necessarily indict every proponent of a religious tradition. So being clear about that in the museum was a high priority for me personally. Even more, and this may not be immediately obvious from the outside, but from the inside, being sensitive to issues of ritual and mourning, which is very much part of religious education and religious consciousness, was critical in the development of the museum, not only because the site itself is obviously a site of mourning, but for a reason that is really very peculiar to this particular project. And that is that the circumstances of the 9/11 attacks in New York, as opposed to at the Pentagon and near Shanksville, meant that you had two 110-story buildings collapse, and human beings quite literally were pulverized. And 16 years later, 40% of the families of people who died at the World Trade Center have received nothing of their loved ones. 40%. There are 8,000 unidentified human remains in the custody of the New York City Medical Examiner. And the Medical Examiner's Office has made a commitment in perpetuity to continue to use increasingly precise DNA analysis to make positive identifications so that remains can be returned to families. We were asked as a site, actually we had to fulfill a promise that was made by then Governor Pataki in 2003 to the family members of victims, that these unidentified remains in the custody of the medical examiner would be repatriated to the World Trade Center site. And the family members, this coalition of family members, made a request that the medical examiner's repository be placed in a certain location. They had certain criteria they wanted honored, and it turned out that the only location in the entire World Trade Center redevelopment site that met those two qualifications was basically inside the space designated for the museum. So we had a big problem, which is that you're bringing people into the public space of a museum, but there's a wall dividing the public space from an inaccessible, non-visible, but there, behind the wall, repository of human remains. So that created a fundamental crisis for us in the planning of the museum, and coming up with the solutions to that, I think required a degree of religious understanding. We certainly conferred with a number of interfaith advisors to come up with our strategies and so forth. So that was something I don't think I would have been prepared for otherwise. There's a particular section, you've seen some of the images of it so far, I believe, in our historical exhibition that speaks about the recovery at Ground Zero, the 9 months that workers were at the site to clear the site of 1.8 million tons of debris. And not only were they clearing the debris, but fundamentally this is called the recovery. It's not called the cleanup. And the recovery meant trying to recover human remains. And that went on for 9 months. And if you were at Ground Zero for a day or for every day for 9 months, it was something that sears the soul. It was horrible. It was hell on earth. And we have a section in the history exhibit called Search for Meaning, because the recovery workers were desperate to try to make sense of what made no sense and to heal themselves from what they were seeing every day. And one of the great stories coming out of 9/11 is the World Trade Center cross. Building 6, World Trade Center 6, collapsed, like everything at the site. And there was a field near where World Trade Center 6 had stood that was covered with crossbeams. And one of the crossbeams had a kind of dimension about it. And on one of the transverse beams, there was melted heating vent aluminum that looked as if it was draped over the arm of the transverse beam. And a recovery worker by the name of Frank Selecchia saw it and had a moment. And he believed it was a message from God. He saw it as a cross, not a cross beam. And he brought one of the many FDNY chaplains over to look at it. This happened to be a Franciscan father by the name of Brian Jordan, who saw what Selecchia saw, or saw what Selecchia needed to see, and he consecrated it. And it became known as the Ground Zero Cross, the World Trade Center Cross. This is not it, those are part of the exterior structure. And Mass was held every Sunday, interfaith Mass was held every Sunday at the base of the cross for the 9 months of the recovery, so that anyone seeking comfort, solace, could come there. And when I got to the museum in 2006, literally on day 2 of my tenure, I was called up to the offices of the executive director of the Port Authority. Port Authority owns the World Trade Center site. I will not go into the complications of that. But Port Authority is not in the business of dealing with religious crisis. That's not what they do. There was a big crisis because the World Trade Center cross, which had stood in the same place alongside the West Side Highway on the site of Ground Zero, had to be moved because they were ready to do some reconstruction at the site, to begin reconstruction. And the iron workers were refusing to move it. They wouldn't move it without a guarantee that the cross would be brought back to the site. So they said to me, "Are you going to use the cross in the museum?" And I'm like, I have no idea. I didn't know what the museum was going to look like, much less where the cross would go. And I mean, it was a ridiculous question. And he said, "But we have to have an answer because they're not going to move it unless we say yes." So I said yes. But the yes was conditional, and it was that this is a museum, and it's a non-denominational museum, and we're not putting a consecrated entity into a secular space and then present it as a consecrated entity. We would present it as an artifact of the history. And its having been consecrated was relevant, but we weren't going to hold Mass in the museum every week. And they were fine with that. Turned out that decision led to a lawsuit by the American Atheist Association, who felt that we were violating the First Amendment by promoting a particular faith tradition in the context of a public entity that had received some federal money for the Capitol construction phase. So that was another complication. So being able, again, as a student of the history of religion, to talk about what consecration means, to talk about how objects that under any other circumstances would not have religious value are suddenly invested with religious value, and then what that means and how you interpret that was extraordinarily pertinent in ways that I never would have imagined. We won the lawsuit, by the way. And the best part of it was the judge, it was on appeal, actually. We won the first round, and they came back and they appealed. And on the second round, the judge decided to declare his decision on a Good Friday. That is the World Trade Center cross, yes. So you get the sense. So, it's not just in the creation of the museum that these threads going back to the Divinity School and my time here were pertinent, but the programs that we offer, in September 2015, Pope Francis came to New York City, and he asked through Archbishop Dolan to hold a multi-religious meeting for peace in the museum, in a space we call Foundation Hall, which is dominated by this huge, what's called the slurry wall, original piece of the retaining wall that held back the Hudson River when the World Trade Center was first under construction in the 60s. Pope Francis is absolutely, there you are, the real deal. That's all I can tell you. I'm a Jewish girl from Long Island. I was wowed. Utterly, completely wowed. There's a picture here, right here, how timely. Rabbi Cosgrove, who is the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue, is an alum of UC Div School. What's that?
Rabbi Dr. Cosgrove.
Rabbi Dr. Elliot Cosgrove, right. And Imam Latif is the imam at NYU. And they were, along with, religious leaders of various faith traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, various denominations of, Christian evangelical groups and others. I mean, it was really an amazing event. And if there's time later, I can tell you another story about it. But it was really quite extraordinary. And the fact that the Pope, who could have chosen anywhere, he could have gone to St. Patrick's, for heaven's sake, but he wanted a non-religious space that was sacred. And that he chose that space, which I think is tremendously meaningful. So, the way my training at the Divinity School had the most impact on what I do now has actually a lot less to do with formal religious studies and much more to do with an approach to critical thinking. And I'm thinking about a word I rarely use these days, but was used almost in every breath when I was here, which is hermeneutics. Questions about meaning, the performance of memory, and the ritualization of memory in public spaces. All of that contributed, I think, directly to the decision-making I've had to do in my career and my work. And I hope also to the effectiveness of the visitor experience at the 9/11 Museum. And so just to conclude with the final question that Aaron asked me to think about, which is, what is needed from educators in our society today? I think the first thing is to recognize that there are many ways to educate, and you've heard 3 of them today. It's not always in the classroom or the academy. Granted, that's a good place to start, but there are ways to educate that go beyond the academy. And there are both formal and informal places of learning, and the learning that goes on is no less important and relevant. Museums and public history venues, the web, social media, blog posts, documentaries, and films, these are all forms of teaching. and they benefit from the training you've had here. And then finally, I think the most important thing is to understand how what you know, meaning your subject matter, as well as what skills you've honed here, your ability to do research, your analytical instincts, your writing and communication, are completely transferable. They're not limited to just what you think you are training for. And more importantly, your enthusiasm for teaching others, opening minds and connecting, which is really what is at the heart of the learning process here, is really what is most transferable and is at the heart of teaching, no matter what the environment is that you're teaching in. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. We've got really wonderful, rich set of materials here and about 45 minutes for conversation. So we can open it up. I can play MC and leave things very open. I want to encourage, in addition to any of the comments and questions you may have, I'd also just like to encourage you to pose questions to one another based on what you've seen and heard. And yeah, let's start with you, Andrew. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for just an amazing panel, and even Jeremy. I just wanted to say that I have a question that I think comes from my unboundedness within the academy. And so I know that as a PhD student, I'm familiar with pedagogical competition. I was thinking about competition with different between different pedagogies. And so, like, we're used to a certain kind of competition in the academy. We critique each other. We say, like, no, that's the wrong way to form knowledge. You should explain it this way. But I think you guys deal with something that I have not yet, which is people with true malintent, or who are just misinforming or playing with really destructive kind of power. So perhaps, there's Islamophobic education, which is like deliberately spreading misinformation around the country. There's fake news for Jeremy. I don't know if your example with the American Atheist Association is an example of this, or like the Creationist Museum or something. There's people who are really intending to destroy. And so I don't think I encountered that. So I'd just be interested to hear from all of you in general and in specific, how do you deal with that? And if stories come to mind, just please share.
I can start. I mean, much of the experience of creating the 9/11 Museum was a very robust dialogue of different opinions, and that was both on the inside and with the outside. So our planning team was a diverse group of people, curators and historians and exhibition developers and designers, but the kinds of questions that we had to address they didn't have a single answer. And just, do you show the faces of the perpetrators in a memorial museum? Where you're showing the faces of the victims, are those equivalent? So those kinds of questions were very much argued over. But one of the challenges that we had, and it's not unusual in the field I'm in memorial institutions, which tend to be contentious, is until we opened, the public didn't know what we were presenting. So they would take their anxieties, they would project them on this blank canvas, and then they would get angry at us for what they thought we were going to do. And we found ourselves being defensive about things that had nothing to do with what we actually were working on. But we had a film, one of the things the museum tries to do is to help build literacy about how 9/11 happened. And how do you get from, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which was perpetrated not by Al-Qaeda, but by a group of followers of the blind sheikh, who's an Egyptian, came out of the Muslim Brotherhood. There's some evidence that bin Laden as an individual had funded some of their effort, but there was no Al-Qaeda connection. And get from 93 to 2001. So we felt we owed our public, in the context of the educational mission of the museum, a brief history of the rise of Al-Qaeda. It seemed like the logical thing to do. So we created a 6-minute film. It's dense, but it kind of tracks what, how Al-Qaeda developed after the Soviet-Afghan War and blah, 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 blah. But it doesn't mince words. It says what happened, which is that, Al-Qaeda was a fringe extremist group within the broader universe of Islam. It's not so fringe anymore, but it was fringe then in 2001. That extremism led to a philosophy of, in Al-Qaeda's case, wanting to rid the Middle East, rid Muslim countries of the American presence. And that led ultimately to the 9/11 plot with many steps along the way. We were called out by an interfaith group in New York saying we would be doing more damage to interfaith relations by showing this film, that people would come into the museum, they would see this film, they'd blame all the Muslims, there would be blood on, they actually said there'd be blood on your hands, don't show this film. And we're like, well, how can you explain who these people are? They're not a tsunami that came out of a natural disaster. These are human beings who made a choice to do something out of a philosophy that emanated from their understanding of their faith tradition. Okay, so it was very tough, and it got so bad that one of our educators was asked, they used to go on Fox News to, defend our position. This is before we opened the museum, against one of these interfaith activists, who under any other circumstances I would be applauding her work, but she was making allegations that were not rooted in a full awareness of the entire program of the museum and how we were presenting things. And it was really difficult. So, I think ultimately, like with any argument you've been trained to participate in here, you understand the principles behind your position and you hold to them. Which isn't to say you don't listen and you don't hear the allegations or the opposite view, but if you really believe in your position and have a good reason to go that way, you don't give in. I think it's, there needs to be dialogue, but there also needs to be a kind of a clear rationale for why you're doing what you're doing.
Perspectives from other panelists?
To take a slightly different take on it, I think if you're moving into the realm of being a public intellectual and putting yourself out there, whether in lecture format, written format, or anything else, you just have to be ready for the haters and the trolls. And if you're a woman, there's also another layer on top of that. And I think my skin has gotten thicker because the whole point is to try to push you out of the conversation or intimidate you out of the conversation. And again, it goes to riff off of what you were just saying, Alice, is that you're there for a reason, you articulate your position, and you just hold firm. But that's not to say that the work doesn't take sort of mental and emotional tolls. I know when we do public programming, and my colleague Dr. Humaira Ziad is our scholar of Islam, and we know we're going into a mildly hostile space. She won't go by herself. We will go in pairs or teams, and it's also a helpful way to manage Q&A because there are certain things that people take better from someone who self-identifies as Christian than someone who self-identifies as Muslim. And so it's a balance of knowing where you're going and asking questions about spaces when you accept public engagements or are going into other spaces. And you can ask that up front. You can sort of get a sense of that. And once you do it a few times, you have a better sense of what to ask. I don't know if that's helpful or...
Yeah, that's something that I struggled with quite a bit. And I don't know if I ever came up with a good answer, but I had to constantly ban people from the Facebook page who were posting hateful things. I eventually decided if a piece on the site wasn't commentary and it was about a minority religion, that I was going to turn the comments off because nothing constructive was happening. And that's, NPR actually got rid of their comments altogether, which I don't know if that's the right solution or not. It's not a violation of the First Amendment, because that's not how the First Amendment works. But it is, I don't know how to make sort of the useful and necessary and good parts of dialogue sort of float to the top when on the internet there's so much hate speech, and I don't have an answer for that.
Well, that's disappointing, but otherwise, thank you.
Something on the right before? More familiar? Yeah, John.
So one of the questions that I had was more specifically, it is broader, but my thought was, John, by looking at the 9/11 museum, when I went there, I mean, it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I wonder is in teaching, how do you bridge the gap between sort of that initial emotional response, the thing that gets a student, or in this case the public, to engage with information, to utilizing that for more structured and more critical thinking in terms of education. I mean, the initial visual and beautiful part of it is captivating, but it is surface level in some ways to get to something more educational. And how do you sort of make that transition?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. Well, I assume you also went into the history exhibit. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that exhibit is segregated from the sort of the general pathway of the rest of the museum. It's literally on the footprint of Tower 1, the North Tower, and it takes about an hour minimum to go through, and it's chock-a-block with facts and video and audio recordings, and so it's very much about what happened that day, and then trying to explain the historical context for it, and then the legacy and the aftermath of the attacks. But exhibitions aren't, number one, they can't be encyclopedic because there's physical space limitations and sort of attention span limitations. So you don't attempt to be. You attempt to get that emotional connection deeply enough so that what's coming in up here is actually felt here. And then there's the impulse to, I need to know more. But our educational programming and student programming speaks very much to what you're asking, which is probing these deeper questions and trying to understand the world we live in and making sense of, ISIS. How does ISIS is a metastasis of Al-Qaeda. And how did that happen, and what does it mean in the world we live in today? So, we do interfaith programming. We, we look at these questions in depth in our public programs. But actually, one of the programs I'm most proud of, honestly, is, and it reaches the fewest number of people, but with the greatest depth. And that is, it's called our Museum Ambassadors Program, and it's for high school students in sophomore, junior, and senior year. And they have to apply to get in, and if they get in, it's highly competitive, and we take like 10 or 12 a year for the full academic year. They commit to, something like 29 weeks of coming to the museum after school, and this is like, junior year, they're visiting colleges or studying for SATs or whatever, and they make this commitment, and they get a huge reading list, and they work with our curators and our historians, our educators, and the goal of which is that they have to own the history. They have to own it, and they have to be able to give a tour of the museum that's how they graduate. They can give a tour. So the cohorts are incredibly diverse. They come from all over New York, 5 boroughs, very different backgrounds. And a couple of years ago, we had a group where one of the applicants was a young woman who had been born in Iraq and grown up in Jordan. A Muslim, comes from a Muslim family, observant. Her reason for wanting to do this program was to, A, try to understand why she's looked at as a terrorist, and B, to gain the tools so that she can demonstrate that while she is a Muslim, there is something extremely important and relevant and necessary about her participation in the dialogue, and that she's an American as well. So it was a very, sort of deep, positive, affirmative activist motivation for changing the world she knows she's going to inherit in a couple of years as an adult. And if we can be an incubator for that kind of person to go out into the world, then I feel like we've taken the exhibit experience and made it into something much more powerful.
Any thoughts from our other panelists on what makes for a successful or a barrier to a transition between what sparks interest and then the content, between a headline and the substance, or between the impetus to have an interfaith encounter and then the long, difficult labor of forming relationships?
Can I answer a slightly different question? It's sort of riffing off of what you talked about, the sort of depth versus surface level. I think that there's a way in which, if you have a bounded amount of time with people and they have a bad emotional response or a good emotional response, right, you've got just a very short amount of time. And so to try to account for that is hard. I think that's the harder scenario, is when you've got a really short amount of time. So like 8 hours with people across the city. What can happen? What can go wrong? Who can go back? Who can have a bad group, right? Because certain tables just didn't work out. Other tables were fabulous. What's the sort of special sauce that goes into those dynamics? It's hard to predict. When you have a longer amount of time, like that lovely 29-week program at a smaller cohort of people, if you hit those emotional hurdles, you can get over them and keep going. And so in that way, in those spaces, there's a lot more flexibility or give. And there's, I think, a lot more chance for real transformative learning to happen in those spaces. And so it's the balance, recognizing your own time constraints. I think time constraints really factors into how emotional or affective responses can invite people further, but also close them off.
Yeah, Ronan.
That's Jeremy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, it's a similar thing. How do you choose what to take out, what to include? Everyone's talking about how you kind of can only do the surface level. You can't go super in depth.
Mm-hmm.
As somebody writing online, what do you choose? Because you can either have somebody say, "Oh, I'm going to read this super long piece, this super long article," or they'll do what I imagine a lot of people here do once in a while. I'm going to skip to the end and read the conclusion so I can know what's happening. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sort of like I said in my introductory remarks, tagging something to, like, finding a news hook, finding a reason in the news cycle to talk about whatever the piece is that you want to write is probably the most important thing. I do think people don't necessarily skip long articles. There is, I think, so I published a couple long form articles that were over 2,000 words, and I think as long as you label them long form and people know what they're getting into, that those still get a lot of clicks and a lot of reads all the way through. But yeah, I think just knowing the limitations of a 750-word piece, you're not going to be able to tackle any subject in depth. You can essentially just try to introduce the reader to sort of a framework for understanding what's going on, and sort of it maybe spark an interest that can be explored more later. I think if you quote from a book or something like that and you frame it in an interesting way, then someone could go out and check out the whole book if that's something that they're interested in. But yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
So from all three of you, we've talked a little bit about the haters. And I'm just curious about, for all of your projects, how you reach out to those people who perhaps need the education the most, those people who have those sort of blocks. against even learning about it, or only reading things or participating in things that support what they already think and believe. Is that a part of your goals, and how do you try to? Because a lot of that's changing attitude, right? Before you even get to the education, which you tend to do with that.
In general, folks who engage in interreligious dialogue are a self-selecting group, and so your likelihood of encountering those folks in those spaces is relatively low. And we don't, as an organization, again, we're a staff of 9, and so we don't, as an organization, actively recruit in that space because that's not part of our mission. And that's honestly, it's a staffing finance issue to a large extent. But we hope with our sort of visibility and our other presences in the community that there might be some touch points with those folks who may not self-select into any of our programs or offerings.
My experience is similar. People self-select to come into the museum. We do have some 9/11 truthers who like to stand on the opposite corner and wave signs, but they're not coming in. And again, we wouldn't invite them to engage in a dialogue because we would not want to suggest that their position has any legitimacy. What we choose to do instead is not take them on, but simply show the evidence. The museum presents artifacts, and they can say all they want that there was no Flight 77, which makes me so angry for the people who lost loved ones on that flight. But they will say there was no plane, and we're showing a piece of fuselage, from the plane, and we have security video from a gas station down the street from the Pentagon. There are ways to have the conversation, if you will, without actually being in debate.
Yeah, I think not taking people on is something that was a useful, but sometimes a frustrating part of my job is that I can't go into the comment section as the editor and be like, no, you're wrong. So yeah, not engaging was a big part of that. And I will say though, the comment sections weren't all bleak. There were oftentimes other commenters would take on the role of hoping that you bring in an audience that is interested in learning about things. They will sort of take a commenter to task sometimes, and that was heartwarming to see.
Yeah, I have a question first for Jeremy, just on how you tell stories, or if you're an editor, how you kind of help your writers tell stories. Is there a difference between a religion writer, so someone who just reports the story, or do you see a job as critically engaging or explaining what's happening, or is it just connect? I liked your answer about connecting it to a hook in the news cycle. That's useful. You'd be here's what's going on here. Mm-hmm. But if you're covering I talked to a guy one time who liked to travel around and cover a Wiccan ritual or something like that, and be this is a coherent thing that they're doing. Mm-hmm. It's not just crazy. There's real interests and interested people doing these kind of things. So how do you engage with not just parroting what they want people to know, versus making it your own story, versus there's a complex of issues there. I just wondered the extent to which that comes up, and how you deal with it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the important roles of editors in general, and one thing it's sad to see there are less and less editors. Oftentimes, reporters are now sort of just self-editing and posting their own stories, and I think I don't think you at all have to be a religion writer or exclusively cover the religion beat to write a good religion piece. I think a really good editor or an editor who knows something about the topic is the key sort of to that, to taking a piece and tweaking just the slightest of things to make it more, I guess, educational and interesting and illuminating than sort of were you thinking more like conversion, like propaganda kind of?
Well, I mean, there's a difference between being like, this is what they say is going on, and also tying it into like economic problems, right? We see a lot of journalism happening like this. We're trying to explain voting patterns or like evangelical patterns and things like that. So.
Right. Yeah. No. I think. Yeah. One of the most important parts of that would be sending a piece back after reading it and saying, maybe here are a few things that you might want to answer that would complicate sort of the simple story that you have. Like maybe think about these other factors, or this is very positive. Is there anything negative that would come out of this? Or I guess trying to make sure that it has a good balance.
Yeah. I just was curious how you think through those issues. So.
Yeah, it's tough.
I think if I could offer a sort of add-on to that, I think one of the ways that academics can be of service to the public conversation is when you get a position somewhere, you try to find out who the local religion beat writer is and take the person out for coffee and say, hey, I'm new in town, and then you're a resource. So if he or she doesn't have an editor, as the case may be, but has a question or wants to run something by you, you could be a resource and help ask the questions that you so nicely elucidated. Because I think there's a way in which members of the academy in academia still can have a relationship to folks who are doing writing that benefits sort of society at large. So I toss that out there as when you find your job someday to do that.
Maybe if I can go back to the question about the haters, but kind of flip it a little bit. One of the common threads is the fact that you all work with the public in different ways, right? And one thing I was trying to figure out is how you work out your own normative claims about what you think is good to put out there. The museum is very massive with that lawsuit and all that. Like, how do you take somehow a neutral stand that is able to build up something constructive at the same time not bracket who you are or what the things you believe are good things? So, in your own different cases, I was wondering if you have some comments on how you face what you believe is good and should be out there in terms of claims and exhibit or whatever, and how you negotiate that with your own personal beliefs and your desire to engage a wider audience than just a specific religious community or something like that.
I think that's true for scholarship as well. I think that conversation is not yet settled as far as your personal normative claims versus your intellectual claims. I think so a little backstory on the Institute. So we incorporated the Muslim community, and then the founder has just retired, and I took over in July of 16. And so I feel the weight of your question in a very different way than I did 2 years ago. And I think that there are institutional commitments that you are making on behalf of a variety of stakeholders, for lack of a better term. But I think to go back to what Alice was saying, if you're clear about them and you understand the rationale behind them and you're consistent in that point, then I think that clarity and that transparency is vital so that people do know where you stand as an institution or an organization and what's going on there. I don't think that we as an organization don't try to claim a sort of neutrality. We are confronting anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism. That is what we are doing, right? And that we try to be clear about that, and we have a particular methodology for doing so. And so hopefully that's somewhat responsive.
I can speak to it. It's a little more nuanced in my universe because while our mission is very clear, we're there to commemorate and educate about this event, the way people see the event and interpret the event can be wildly disparate. So very early on in the planning process, a colleague of mine and I were in France for an academic conference, and pretty much every one of the French researchers laid into us about George W. Bush. Were we going to hold him to account? How are we dealing with Iraq? I mean, they didn't care about 9/11 as much as they cared about the decision-making in the aftermath of 9/11. And it was really an instructive moment for us because we began to realize that, if we took polarizing positions, that it might actually undermine our effort to do what we were there to do. Which isn't to say that we shouldn't address them, but we needed to address them without the institution making an editorial comment about it. So it's one thing to say, in the aftermath of 9/11, you had many people join the armed services to defend their country. That was not an uncommon response at a certain age level in the aftermath of 9/11, that the country had certain ways of responding, and that there were consequences to those ways of responding. That's reporting it. It's not editorializing it. And so we realized that we had to be very careful. That said, there were certain fundamentals that we would never, ever take an opposite stand on, okay? There was no way we were going to present the perpetrators as legitimate in any way, shape, or form. Okay, they were acting criminally when they did what they did, and they chose to do it. Okay, I don't care that they were well educated. I don't care that they came from middle class families. I don't care that they thought they were doing something, wonderful for all eternity. I care that they made a decision that was completely anathema to civilized behavior. So there are certain things that we will not budge on, and we will not engage on. But there are others where we had to be extremely cautious, and I'm a dyed-in-the-wool liberal, true confession. It was very hard for me to sort of step back and not make a comment, but that wasn't my job. Okay, I could do that at home. But in the context of this project, with its diverse constituencies and people coming from everywhere, our job was to document, not to make comment, and to allow the conversation about those consequences of this event. That's a great conversation to have with people with different points of view.
Yeah, that is a great question, and is something I struggled with a lot. But I did luck into the fact that when I came into my job, there was already an audience for the site, and an audience that was a good percentage was Mormon and a good percentage was conservative Catholic, and so I was catering to an audience that was already very different than my personal experiences, and so I was already seeking out different perspectives. But that is one of the biggest tension that I've seen in religion writing currently, is how inclusive, what does inclusivity mean when people hold exclusive views, and how can being inclusive, are you going to tolerate everything except for intolerance? Is sort of a big question these days, and where do you draw the line? And so I saw that coming out a lot, but I think the biggest thing I would say from my perspective is actively seeking out interesting perspectives that are very far from your own was something that benefited me a lot. And one of my favorite pieces that I had the privilege to edit for the site was by a rabbi out in California that was called The Perils of Particularism, and it was sort of talking about what it means to hold sort of exclusivist views, and why that's an okay thing, and that it was very different from my experience, but was very illuminating. So.
To play a little bit off of what Jeremy was saying, sorry.
No
I think one of the other institutional commitments that we have is to present a diversity of within Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and to just break down the basic monoliths that people are operating in. And so while I'm consciously making a choice to teach about Dorothy Day, I also do so within the context of saying that that is one particular reading of Matthew, but that's not the reading of Matthew. That's not what we're in the business of doing. And so it is making a choice to present certain things, but it's also saying at the same time that we're not saying that those are necessarily normative for all Christians. Dorothy Day is not normative for all Christians, right? And so making sure that the public audience is aware of that is a balance between making choices. I mean, you also do that when you're crafting a syllabus, right? You're editorializing, you're curating a certain stream of readings, and there are possibilities for other ways that you can go and with a certain topic, but you are making choices, and to just name that as an activity, I think, is somewhat helpful.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing about the work you do. I'm interested in learning more about the vision you hold for interfaith work in specifically with ICJS. And I lived in Baltimore, so I actually was able to participate in your Imagining Justice in Baltimore. It was personally transformative, so thank you, and probably part of the here. And I'm interested in hearing more about your vision statement and what, correct me, an interreligious, a model interreligious city.
Yes.
What does that look like?
That's what I hope to be spending the next 30 years exploring, both theoretically, theologically, and no, I joke, but no, I don't joke. Yeah. We're actually trying to articulate that as a framework. To relate it back to a previous conversation, we're trying to sort of talk about the city and what does it mean to have heterogeneous environments that allow you to have embodied co-learners as opposed to hermeneutical others. So this allows me to tap into my inner Hyde Park on occasion. And so what does it mean, right? So a lot of times people are like, oh my gosh, you need to take your work globally. I'm like, well, don't think that's going to work exactly, because if you go into certain environments, in rural Ohio or something, where it's a mostly homogenous environment, you don't have a robust Jewish and Muslim community with which you can do this co-learning work. And so our vision, our pedagogy of interfaith co-learning is very specific to cities, to urban environments where you have a critical number of people who are living together. And so it's not universal. It will not work in other places and spaces. And I think part of working in institutions or nonprofits is also saying, this is what we're doing, this is not what we're doing, and that's okay. To be able to sort of define that lane, I think, is really important. And so the whole idea of interfaith and interreligious and playing with those terms and defining them in a variety of ways, and then the idea of the city, the cosmopolitan, I mean, all of that is sort of a swirl that we're excited to explore in both theoretical, and practical programmatic ways. So, and you did look familiar, so this is delightful for you to, yeah.
Other thoughts from our panel on what might make for a healthy interreligious environment? You can take that if you like, or don't have to.
I will say this sort of touches on that. I never really thought of what I did as interfaith necessarily. I thought of it more as sort of the section that I run is trying to represent and explain the various religious traditions in America, and so it was necessarily going to be have multiple faiths and multiple denominations and multiple ideologies within those denominations represented. But it really did resonate with me the way that you described the goal of interfaith work is so similar to the goal of religion journalism. And I never really thought about that before your remarks, but I'm not going to get it exactly how you said, but the idea of having a deep understanding of others, sort of without an inclination towards conversion or debate on whether certain beliefs are true or correct. That's also religion journalism, so that is interesting to think of it in that context.
We have time for one, maybe two more questions, and then I have a concluding question for the panel. Yeah.
So, Alice, you have this really striking phrase, the performance of memory. And I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit more about what this means and how we actually talk about the performance in an educational context. Because We do it all the time, right? We do it ritually, we do it in text. Hell, even the clothes we wear, like sagging pants, right? It's a performative statement, and it's a statement of solidarity with prisoners who wear baggy clothes, or were forced to wear baggy clothes, or clothes that didn't fit right. And so how do you articulate that to an audience? And this is for the entire panel. How do you articulate that to an audience in such a way as, even if they're not necessarily going to experience what you want them to experience, you can get them into the headspace so that they're highly sympathetic to this sort of experiential, these experiential statements or these processes, right? That they may not believe that the Eucharist is the transformed body and blood of Christ, but there's a way in which you can articulate it to them in such a way as them being sympathetic to that sort of understanding, right? That they can actually buy into the transformation, at least in the abstract, right? How do you do that? How do you actually express that to an audience, right, of people who don't have particular convictions or aren't necessarily open to what you are trying to say?
Well, I'll tell you our approach. First of all, I do believe that memory is a transformative action, or has the potential to be transformative. And in our instance, it was about telling stories. Okay, 9/11 was witnessed by 2 billion people on a single day. That was a third of the world's population in 2001. So you open a museum 13 years after an event that 2 billion people have witnessed, you're not going to start by saying, I have something I need to tell you and you don't know enough about. Right? They're all walking in as experts in their own memory of that day. So part of what we saw our role as was to both affirm our recognition that I know you have a story. This is a museum about stories. Join into the storytelling. We provide that opportunity physically with recording studios where you can tell your story. But the entire museum journey is storytelling. And narrative is the age-old way of teaching, right? Of understanding not just the world you live in, but yourself. So for me, this is the girl who wanted to study myth and ritual here. And I've come a long way around to getting back to that, but, here I am. You look at the Passover Seder, for 2,000 years, Jews have sat around a table for 2 nights, sometimes for 3, in the spring, reading the same story over and over and over and over and over again. Okay. Now we know the ending, and it's like no surprise. Why do we do that, right? Well, the Haggadah, the narrative itself tells you why you do that, okay? You invite the youngest members of the tribe to ask the question so you can tell the story, right? So it's not for me, it's for them. And what is it telling them? It's telling them the kind of person you want them to grow up to be, the kind of human being that will be valued. Okay, that is what the Haggadah is. It's an ethical chapbook. That is what it's about. Okay? We were slaves in the land of Egypt. Do not treat the stranger badly. Okay? Because you were a stranger once. That's the refrain. Okay? Understand who you are, where you came from, and how you should behave. That's potentially transformative if we pay attention. Okay? So the performance of memory in museum space is just that. You're moving through a narrative. It happens to be in physical form. As one of our great advisors said to us, it's no different than theater. The only difference is in theater, you're sitting still and the actors are moving. In a museum, you're moving and the actors sit still. Right? So, but the impact is the same. Right? It's the story, the crisis, the denouement, and you walk away and you think about it, and you think about it, and you think about it. And that's really, I think, what the performance of memory is about in any religious context, in any human context. It's coming to terms with who you are.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts on this issue?
I think the answer for me would for my work would be very similar, which is that you tell a good story, and and one of the benefits of narrative storytelling is that you get to glimpse a little slice of maybe what the life is like of someone who you would never meet in everyday life, and will necessarily evoke empathy with that person.
I would add to that the importance of place and location to certain performances of dialogue. That we have our own building, and there's a certain type of work we can do in our own building. There's a different kind of work. So IJB, the Reimagining Justice program, when we go out into community and we're in an HBCU, the Black Catholic Church, an urban synagogue, and then the Islamic Society of Baltimore, which was visited by President Obama. And so allowing people to enter into spaces where they otherwise wouldn't have walked into is transformative and opens them in a certain way that coming to our building doesn't all the time. And so being aware that when you're choosing different places and locations, that has an effect on the program that's happening. So I think I can share this anecdote here. The Catholic Church we chose as St. Bernardine's on Edmondson Avenue on the west side of Baltimore. And it's unlike any Catholic space I think I have ever seen, because there are a lot of people in the community who grew up in Protestant spaces, and so they've modified the structure of the church to have the choir behind the altar. These are things that I feel like you'll understand when you walk in, you're like, huh. And the other thing, the St. Bernardine's was originally built by Eastern European Catholics, and the priest prior to the priest there now chose to overlay African iconography alongside European iconography, but to not remove the European iconography. So you have a white Mary and a black Mary. You have a white Jesus and a black Jesus. The Stations of the Cross are all in duplicate. Literally the whole space is in duplicate. And it's stunning. And if you're a person who is familiar or conversant with religious spaces, like I walked in and I was like, yes, we need to use this space. But I also walked away with a slight concern, because for a lot of our Jewish and Muslim and non-religious believers, I'm like, are they going to think that this is a normative space? I'm like, and then going back to your question, well, how do I feel about the fact that they might walk away thinking this is a normative space? And, sort of toying with that in the process of thinking about the performance of public education. I think context is really something that you should be aware of if you're ever in the position to actually plan a public program.
So concluding question for the panel. Heather intuited that I was going to ask it and has already answered it, but you should feel free to weigh in further if you would like to. What would be something from your wish list for how university educators are engaging with the public or otherwise conceiving of their work in continuity with your own?
Well, it's a fairly obvious answer. It's not really particularly novel, but we couldn't have created our exhibitions without historians. I mean, we were not about to put out anything that wasn't 100% accurate historically with the information that we have at our disposal at this moment. So we had a number of historians who were part of our planning teams and our advisors and our readers, and and we had a number of interfaith advisors as well all along the way, because not that we didn't trust our instincts, but we didn't feel like we were the only people equipped to come to the answers, and we really would benefit from the multiplicity of perspectives that people in different disciplines could give us. And I think it made for a major improvement on the ultimate product.
Your question reminded me that one of my college courses in political science, we had to read part of the syllabus was that we actually had to subscribe to a newspaper, and then occasionally as a class would talk about the various goings on and how that related to what we were studying, and I think that obviously makes sense in the field of politics, but I think that would also be useful in religious studies. Obviously every course can't do this, but I think it would be helpful to not just talk about how what you are studying relates to current events, but maybe specifically engage in an article and talk about how, maybe whether it's good journalism or bad journalism, engage in a specific text as a class with other people that sort of talk about how was this framed, how would you change this, what did you like about it, and sort of maybe incorporating not just talking about what's going on into class, but actually maybe using journalism articles as sort of a text to all look at as a class. I think that could be really useful in some courses.
I'll reiterate what I said before. If you find yourself in an academic position and you plan on being there for the long term, to invest in community relationships and see yourself as being in service to the community, because you are coming out of this institution with a robust set of skills and gifts and the ability to ask critical questions and help people ask slightly more complicated questions is something that I think is sorely needed just generally. And the other sort of practical piece of advice is that if you're invited to give a public lecture, to write it out and then cut it in half. And realize that your public audience is maybe going to take 1 or 2 points home at max. And so what are your 2 points, right? Again, it goes back to the idea of curation, even with the syllabus and everything else. You have to make choices. And I think that one of the gifts of a University of Chicago education, but one of the curses of a University of Chicago education is that you can footnote yourself into oblivion, right? And that's a danger with public lectures, that if you run off on too many tangents, people walk away with nothing. And so if you are in the position of giving a public lecture, choose 1 or 2 points that you want the audience to go home with, and then have different access points for those 2 points, and be satisfied with that. Is it, could you do more? Of course. But if you do too much, then the sort of takeaway can be not beneficial for the audience.
Thank you. So it's time to bring our session to a close with words of wisdom. Please do stick around. Feel free and enjoy leftover food and coffee. Please do sign in if you haven't already. And please join me in thanking our wonderful